The US government is bankrupt. With over $31 trillion in debt, this path to insolvency has massive implications for you and for the US economy. It's just not what you think. In this video, we're going to uncover the unsustainable path of US fiscal policy and reveal what the real effects will be. No, the US dollar won't collapse because of this ballooning debt burden, but the negative consequences might be just as bad. The federal government has about $31 trillion in debt and $25 trillion in revenue, or GDP. This means that the federal government has a debt burden equal to about 125% of the size of the US economy. This is the largest debt burden the United States has ever had, and this is only going to get worse. Government spending has steadily increased over the last 50 years. In the 1960s, government spending was equal to about 28% of the economy. Over the last several decades, the government has become more and more involved in the economy, with average spending rising to 37% of GDP. This is graphed as a 5-year average because we want to capture the long-term trends rather than the noisy up and downs. Not only has the government been spending more and more, the composition or the blend of the spending has radically changed. In the 1960s, 70% of what the government was spending was on what's called discretionary items. Discretionary government spending is spending that has to be renewed each year by Congress, which includes things like defense spending, education programs, and foreign aid. In the 1960s, about 30% of government spending was mandatory, which is spending that is built into law. It cannot be changed. Mandatory spending is mostly made up of what's called the entitlement programs, or Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, plus interest on the debt. Today there has been a complete flip. 75% of all government spending is mandatory. It cannot be changed. Only 25% of government spending is the discretionary kind. This is a massive problem because this mandatory spending, these entitlement programs, are going to explode in size over the next 10 years as all the baby boomers enter their retirement years. By 2032, by the government's own projections, this mandatory government spending will be 100% of US tax revenue. This chart shows that in the 1960s, about 25 cents of every dollar the government spent had to be borrowed, and 75 cents was funded with tax money. Today, 60 cents of every dollar the government spends has to be borrowed, and only 40 cents is funded with taxes. As these entitlement programs explode in size, that means the government is going to have to raise taxes or borrow even more. Taxes have been creeping up over the last several decades. In the 1960s, taxes averaged about 25% of GDP, and now they are about 29% of GDP. Higher taxes will clearly hurt the economy, but what if politicians are reluctant to raise taxes and rather take the path of least resistance, which is just to keep borrowing more and more money? In economics, there is a concept called net national savings, or the savings for the entire economy. When we hear expressions like savings equals investment, this refers to net national savings. Most people only think in terms of household savings, but there is also corporate savings, foreign sector savings, and there is government savings. The government normally runs major budget deficits, so this is negative savings for the government sector. The combination of the savings from all of these sectors is called net national savings. Let's look at the 1940s. In the early 1940s, in order to fund World War II, the government ran a budget deficit or negative savings to the tune of negative 25%. But net national savings, the whole pie, was actually quite healthy in the 12 to 15% range. How is this possible? Well, the private sector savings rate exploded to almost 30% in the early 1940s. So even though the government ran negative savings, the private sector more than offset that negative savings with large positive savings. Over the last several decades, net national savings has been collapsing from an average rate of 12% to just 3% after the pandemic. The government is borrowing tons of money, and the private sector simply cannot save enough to offset what the government is not saving. If the private sector saved more, that would mean less consumption or less investment. Both of these outcomes would hurt the economy. So what do we know so far? We know that the government budget deficits are going to get bigger and bigger in the future because this mandatory spending or these entitlement programs are going to grow to at least 100% of tax revenue over the next 10 years. The amount of borrowing from the government will go up. There is almost no question about this. These larger budget deficits will have to be met with either higher private savings or a larger and larger trade deficit. Remember that private savings has two parts, household and corporate. Since 1929, households saved an average of 9% of their income. Today, the savings rate for households is down to 5%, so there is a limit to how much lower this can go. So if households cannot offset government spending like they did in the 1940s, that leaves two options: a wider trade deficit, meaning that the foreign sector needs to finance the deficits, or private investment will have to suffer. And this is where many people get it wrong. They believe that the Federal Reserve, when they do quantitative easing, can act as a source of economic savings, and therefore a free lunch. This is not true. The Federal Reserve can change the nature of the government liability from a long-term liability to a short-term liability, but the Federal Reserve is not a source of savings. Quantitative easing can make the debt burden easier by reducing interest expense, but the Fed is not a source of savings. So what's going to happen is the net national savings rate is going to fall, and for now, this will manifest in two ways. First, the trade deficit is going to get wider, and second is that private sector investment will fall. By investment, we mean physical investment, not investment in stocks or financial assets. This chart shows that as the net national savings rate has been grinding down, so has the rate of private investment as a share of GDP. This chart shows the rate of investment in structures, equipment, and residential construction. In the 1980s, the economy plowed almost 18% of our output into these investments. This generates productivity and new sources of income, allowing the economy to accelerate and make sustained improvements in the quality of life. If we strip out residential investment and we only look at structures and equipment, we can see directly what the negative consequences of a highly indebted government are. The government starts to absorb all the resources in the economy and deploys them in highly unproductive ways, which starves the private sector, the more productive sector, of these very resources. Investment in structures and equipment includes hospitals, medical buildings, power plants, electrical grids, air transportation, rail transportation, communication equipment, medical equipment, industrial supplies, agriculture equipment, improvements to trucks and vehicles, and so much more. An economy does not make advancements through consumption or through government spending. An economy only makes advancements through productivity gains by investing in these critical areas. Think about the stories that we hear today about water systems breaking down, air transportation cancellations, and electric grids failing, and then think about all the lost productivity of these events compounding year after year. It really adds up over time. In the 1980s, we spent 12% of our GDP on these areas compared to 8% today. That would be the equivalent of an extra $1 trillion per year that we could be spending on improving the efficiency of the country's infrastructure and making rapid productivity gains if we had sufficient savings. But we don't. All of our resources are going towards offsetting government borrowing, and these government funds are simply used as transfer payments or entitlement payments. In the 1960s, 15 cents of every dollar the government spent went towards transfer payments. Today, almost half of every dollar the government spends goes towards funding these transfer payments. Now, this all sounds like the US dollar is doomed, but we have to remember that currencies and countries are judged on a relative basis. The US is doomed relative to what, or relative to who? If we look at the major economies of the world, including the United States, Europe, Japan, and China, as bad as the situation is in the United States, it's worse everywhere else. According to the IMF, as of 2021, The US had public and private sector debt equal to 332% of GDP, but it's higher in the euro area, higher in China, and way higher in Japan. The two factors that make up a country's ability to grow are debt and demographics. Debt, as we just outlined, reduces a country's ability to make productive investments, which starves the economy of the ability to make genuine advancements in the quality of life. If we look at demographics, Europe, China, and Japan all have negative population growth in their working age cohort. So higher debt and negative population growth for all of the major US competitors means that the US is comparatively stronger, and the result of this has been a very strong US dollar. So we have to keep this in mind and put our biases aside when making judgments about the United States. It's a relative game. Every other major nation has higher total debt levels and way worse demographics than the United States. All of that quantitative easing that the US did, which was supposed to crash the US dollar, did not because of this relative game. So the US has a better relative standing than all the other major countries, which will keep upward pressure on the US dollar and prevent a hyperinflationary outcome from what is clearly an unsustainable fiscal path. The government is locked into massive borrowing needs over the next 10 years, and these borrowing needs will have to be offset by higher household savings, which means lower consumption and less growth, or by a larger trade deficit, which means we have to export more US jobs abroad, or by reducing the rate of private investment in structures and equipment. The US consumer will likely not want to lower their standard of living by consuming less and saving more, and there are some limits to how wide the trade deficit will go. It's already at record levels. So the insolvency of the US government will manifest itself as a continued collapse of private investment in critical infrastructure, which will erode productivity and reduce the standard of living. Real GDP per capita in the US used to grow at about 2.1% per year over the course of history, but since we've moved into this high government debt era and started to reduce our rate of private investment in these key areas, we've lost almost 50% of our productivity gains, and now the economy can only sustain about 1% rates of growth. The insolvency of the US government will not result in hyperinflation, but rather a collapse in the standard of living by starving the private sector of resources and of incentives to make productivity-enhancing investments. This is a slow-moving effect that compounds year after year. By the end of this decade, we'll be lucky if the US economy can sustain rates of growth above 1%. 0% growth is more likely to be in our future because of this path. And also, just a quick note, I noticed that only 5% of the people watching my videos are subscribed to this YouTube channel. So if you enjoy this video and want more just like it, subscribe and hit the bell below. It really helps out the channel.